There is a silence that doesn't comfort it, unsettles. A stillness that doesn't soothe it, warns. You've felt it before. In the room with someone who smiles politely, says all the right things, never raises their voice. And yet, something feels off. Not wrong in any obvious way, but disturbingly misplaced. Your body tenses. Your instinct recoils, even while your mind tries to rationalize. This person isn't yelling. They aren't threatening. They're calm, well-mannered, maybe even charming, and still you feel unsafe. Carl Jung wrote that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. But what about the person who never even tries, who builds their life upon rejection, not of others, but of themselves? The most dangerous person isn't loud, because they've learned how to wear the perfect silence. Their danger isn't chaos, it's control. Perfectly curated, meticulously contained. These are not people who explode, they implode and take others with them. Jung called it the persona, the social mask we wear to navigate the world. But for some, the mask is no longer a mask, it's all that remains. When a person becomes completely identified with their persona, they forget there was ever something behind it. They stop being someone and start performing someone. And the longer this continues, the more disconnected they become from their own humanity. You won't hear them lash out. You won't see the cracks immediately. That's what makes them dangerous. They've buried the shadow so deeply that it no longer whispers in the dark, it manipulates in daylight. Jung warned of this risk. That which is unconscious does not disappear, it acts. The more denied it is, the more power it gains. And in those who refuse to face it, the shadow doesn't remain hidden forever. It seeks projection. You begin to feel the effect of this when they accuse you of things you never said, or feel punished for emotions you didn't express. Slowly you realize you are not being seen, you are being used as a screen. A screen onto which they project everything they cannot bear in themselves. You become the villain in their story, the threat in their peace, the chaos in their calm. And all of it happens with an eerie sense of conviction. These people don't lie consciously, they believe what they're saying. That's the horror of it. They believe the narrative their unconscious has constructed, and their voice remains calm because they are not wrestling with doubt. You are. You doubt your intuition. You question your memory. You wonder if maybe you really did something wrong. That's the trap. The most dangerous person isn't loud because they've mastered the art of internal suppression. And suppression is not the same as healing. It is freezing a volcano and calling it a garden. Nietzsche once said, "Whoever fights monsters should see to it that he does not become a monster. But the quiet ones, the ones who never admit to fighting anything, are the most at risk. They believe they've conquered their darkness because they don't see it. But what they've really done is let it slip into others. The battle they won was only against awareness, not the instinct. Sometimes danger isn't the presence of violence. It's the absence of authenticity. It's the conversation that feels too smooth, the gestures too measured, the concern too scripted. These people often rise to positions of influence not because of manipulation, but because they reflect back exactly what others want to see. The more you admire them, the less you question them. And the less you question them, the more power the mask gains. But make no mistake, behind every mask is a buried truth. And the longer it's buried, the more twisted it becomes when it finally finds a way out. To recognize this kind of person, don't look for noise, look for void. The void where genuine emotion should be. The absence of contradiction. The terrifying consistency. True humanity is flawed, inconsistent, messy. The person who seems untouched by inner struggle may not be evolved, they may be dissociated. And dissociation isn't transcendence. It's abandonment. They've abandoned their shadow. They've abandoned their sorrow. They've abandoned their inner life. And in doing so, they've become vessels for something far more destructive than anger denial. The most dangerous person isn't loud, because their silence has nothing to do with peace. It's a fortress, a beautifully built, emotionally sterile defense against truth. And when you enter that fortress thinking you're safe, you don't realize that you've just stepped into a war zone, one that's been waiting for someone like you to wear the blame. Because in their world, it's never them. They don't rage, they don't break. They reflect, they suggest, they redirect. And in doing so, they distort your very sense of reality. You think you're losing them. But in truth, you are losing yourself. There is a terrifying moment, quiet, barely perceptible, when someone stops pretending and starts believing the performance. What was once a mask becomes fused with their skin, not physically, but psychologically. They don't wear it anymore, they are it. You look into their eyes and see nothing you can hold on to. No warmth, no contradiction, no hesitation. Just a kind of polished certainty. And if you aren't paying attention, it feels like confidence, even like strength. But what you're witnessing isn't strength. It's absence. An absence so total it mimics control. An absence so practiced it passes for presence. Carl Jung called this the danger of persona identification. The person loses access to their inner self because the mask has become so successful, so adaptive, that it no longer feels like a performance. It becomes the identity. But here's the cost. When you lose access to your own inner contradictions, you also lose empathy for contradiction in others. You become a judge without a mirror, a saint with a sealed past. And worst of all, you begin to believe you have no shadow. But the shadow doesn't care what you believe. It doesn't need your permission to act. And when it does, it doesn't come through rage, it comes through righteousness. Projection is the tool of the silent destroyer. Not overt cruelty, not emotional chaos, just subtle, cold, misplaced judgment. The most dangerous person isn't the one who argues. It's the one who calmly decides what role you play in a story they've never told you they were writing. You weren't cast, you were assigned. And suddenly you're the problem, the disappointment, the betrayer. Not because of anything you've done, but because of something they've never faced. They don't attack directly. That would be too human, too messy. Instead, they destabilize. They imply. They withhold. They gently offer narratives that make you question yourself. And they do it all without ever raising their voice. Their stillness becomes your madness. Their composure becomes your unraveling. And the more confused you feel, the more right they seem. That's how the game works. Not by making you believe their truth, but by making you doubt your own. This is why the most dangerous person isn't loud. Because loudness reveals. It breaks the spell. It shatters the illusion. But silence maintains the frame. And within that frame, you will sacrifice your instincts, your memories, even your boundaries, just to restore the sense of harmony that never really existed. You'll walk away from conversations replaying every word, wondering what you missed, where you went wrong, how you became the enemy. And they'll walk away untouched, serene, gracious, and utterly unaware of the damage left behind. Friedrich Nietzsche warned us about this kind of person when he said, "Distrust all in whom the impulse to punish is powerful." But punishment isn't always loud. Sometimes it's polite, it's spiritual. It's dressed in healing language and moral superiority. And that makes it harder to name. The most dangerous person can seem like a guide. They speak in calm tones. They express concern. They claim to want truth. But truth is not what they're after. Control is, not of you, but of the image they've built of themselves. And if you threaten that image, if your truth disrupts their performance, they will choose the mask over the relationship every single time. These people are not monsters. That's the hardest part to accept. They are not evil. They are often deeply wounded. But they have chosen a path that feels safer than self-awareness. A path that avoids pain by projecting it. A path that hides insecurity behind confidence, confusion behind clarity, fear behind perfection. They've mistaken self-erasure for healing. And in doing so, they've become agents of unconscious harm. You won't find rage here. You won't find volatility. What you'll find is smoothness, clean lines, well-packaged interactions. But underneath it all is a split so deep, it distorts reality. And if you stay too long, you will begin to split too. You will find yourself apologizing for things you didn't do, dimming parts of yourself to avoid judgment, editing your honesty to preserve peace, until one day you don't recognize your own voice anymore, only theirs echoing in your head. This is not about blaming. It's about recognizing. Because once you recognize the pattern, the spell breaks. Once you name the distortion, the confusion fades. And when you walk away, not angrily, not dramatically, but quietly, you begin to reclaim, what was taken, your own perception, your intuition, your inner compass. The most dangerous person isn't loud because they don't need to be. Their power lies in the subtlety of their distortion, in their ability to convince you not through force, but through doubt, through the slow erosion of your certainty, through the silence that doesn't soothe, but suffocates. And yet, the real tragedy is this: they are often unaware. They don't wake up planning to harm. They wake up trying to survive, trying to hold together a self they no longer feel, trying to avoid the collapse they've kept at bay for years. But survival without self-awareness becomes sabotage. And sabotage dressed in silence is still sabotage. They don't need to scream, because they've already planted the seed of your unraveling. You begin to notice the unraveling when your instincts betray you, when you feel discomfort but call it misunderstanding, when you feel dismissed but interpret it as your own sensitivity. It's not that the dangerous person tells you what to think. It's that they slowly erode your ability to trust that you ever knew how. This is the long psychological game of the silent manipulator. And it's not driven by malice. It's driven by disconnection from their shadow, from their needs, from their wounds. Carl Jung taught that the shadow is not just the dark parts of ourselves, it's the denied, the unseen, the repressed. And what we repress, we will project. Not might, will. In the most dangerous people, this projection is not explosive, it's elegant. It's layered into their charm, woven into their smiles. And it arrives as help, as wisdom, as moral clarity. But there is something beneath the surface, an edge that is not quite right, a smile that doesn't reach the eyes, advice that feels more like control. It's not just what they say, it's the quality of their presence. There's a weight to it, a subtle gravity that pulls you out of yourself and into their narrative. And once you're there, once you've entered the frame they've constructed, the only way to stay is to shrink. These people often speak of truth, but not to discover it, only to defend their version of it. They claim to value growth, but only when it moves in the direction they prescribe. They praise authenticity, but only the kind that doesn't challenge their own image. And when you bring something raw, something real, something that doesn't fit their performance, they won't meet it with curiosity. They'll meet it with quiet invalidation, not open disagreement. That would require risk, vulnerability. Instead, they'll imply that you are unstable, that you misunderstood, that your reality is skewed. And in that moment, something terrible begins to happen inside you. You start to edit yourself. You start to reframe your memories to fit their comfort. You start to protect them from your truth. Because somewhere inside you've realized if you show too much of your reality, you'll lose their love. But what kind of love requires your erasure? Nietzsche once said, "They muddy the waters to make them appear deep." And that's exactly what this person does with your mind. Their silence isn't absence, it's strategy. A way to maintain control without confrontation. A way to distort without getting their hands dirty. And you, caught in the gravity of their emotional void, begin to feel like you are the one falling short. This is not about people who are quiet by nature. This is not about introverts or soft speakers. This is about those who use the performance of peace as a weapon. The ones who don't express anger, not because they've transcended it, but because they've hidden it so deeply, it seeps out through control judgment and subtle dehumanization. They've convinced themselves they are healed because they no longer feel the wound. But healing is not the absence of pain, it is the integration of it. And what they have done is amputate, not transform. These people often have a spiritual glow, a psychological vocabulary. They speak of mindfulness boundaries, compassion. But listen closely. The words are hollow, recited, not lived. There is no humility, no curiosity about their own darkness, only rehearsed reflections and subtle superiority. And this perhaps is the most dangerous aspect of all they truly believe they are, beyond harm, not just for themselves, but for others. Jung called this psychic inflation, when the ego identifies with archetypal energies and begins to believe it is divine, enlightened, untouchable. The person no longer sees themselves as a flawed human navigating complexity. They see themselves as a vessel of truth, a healer, a guide, and you, by comparison, are the one in need of correction. In their presence, your wounds are no longer sacred. They are evidence of your inferiority. But there's a reason their language feels off. There's a reason their peace feels performative. Because it is. Because somewhere along the line, they made a trade. The truth for the mask, the mess for the illusion, the self for the persona. And while that trade may have protected them once, now it isolates them. Because the deeper truth is, they are afraid, terrified even, not of you, but of themselves, of the feelings they buried, the pain they never processed, the rage they intellectualized, the guilt they turned into moral superiority. Their silence is not serenity, it is suppression. And what is suppressed will always return, not as a whisper, but as a projection, a coldness, a punishment wrapped in concern. And you will feel it even if you can't explain it. This is the soul-level danger of the person who isn't loud. They don't scare you with volume. They seduce you with false harmony. They don't control you with force. They control you by convincing you that your discomfort is a flaw you need to fix. They don't ask you to betray yourself. They just create a world where being yourself feels too unsafe. And so you begin to disappear, quietly, piece by piece, until one day the silence between you is not a lack of sound, but the sound of your own absence. There is a moment, often long delayed, when the illusion begins to break. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but like waking from a dream you didn't know you were in. A strange disorientation sets in. You start to see things you overlooked. the way you hesitated before speaking, the way you braced before sharing something real, the way you adjusted, minimized, performed, not because you were asked to, but because you were conditioned to. And now, as you begin to remember who you were before the distortion, something ancient rises in you. Not anger, not revenge, just a quiet, bone-deep clarity. This isn't love. This isn't safety. This isn't truth. Carl Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." But what happens when you realize that someone else's unconscious has been directing your life? That their shadow has been living in your house, wearing your name, shaping your sense of reality? What happens when you stop mistaking their silence for peace and recognize it as denial? The collapse doesn't come with shouting. It comes with a pause, a breath, a sentence you no longer explain, a feeling you no longer dismiss. You speak, and this time, you don't scan their face for approval. You tell the truth, and you let the discomfort rise. You hold your ground, not in protest, but in presence. And it becomes clear sometimes, painfully so, that they cannot meet you there. Not because they don't want to, but because they don't know how. The most dangerous person isn't loud. And so their collapse isn't loud either. It's the implosion of a structure that was never real. The identity they projected. The moral high ground they claimed. The persona they lived inside for so long that it hardened around them. When it begins to crumble, you might feel compassion, or pity, or grief. But you'll also feel something else: distance. The sacred distance of boundaries rediscovered. The holy separation of your soul from their shadow. This moment of awakening is not vindication, it's reckoning. You see that they were never fully present, not with you, and not with themselves. That every word, every gesture, every moment of seeming connection was filtered through a subconscious agenda: I must remain who I pretend to be. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. You stop trying to heal them. You stop trying to explain yourself. You stop trying to make the relationship into something it never was. Because now you understand the danger was never in what they said. It was in what they denied. The rage they never expressed. The fear they never admitted. The wounds they never touched. You were never fighting with them. You were fighting with the unconscious. With the archetypes they had become possessed by. With the shadow they could not integrate. And that battle was never yours to win. Adler wrote that all neurosis stems from the denial of inferiority. The most dangerous people have not resolved their inferiority, they've masked it with superiority. With control, with silence. They need you to be wrong, so they can be right. They need you to be broken, so they can be whole. And they will never say this aloud. They don't even know it consciously. But you will feel it. In their absence after your vulnerability. In their detachment after your confession. In their cold intellectualization of things that once tore you apart. This is how the psyche defends itself when truth feels too threatening. It constructs an identity that cannot be questioned. A spiritual persona, a moral facade, a psychological fortress where everything looks enlightened but nothing is felt. And that is the tragedy. Because beneath all of it, buried deep, is a terrified child, a forgotten pain, a story that was never allowed to be told. You can love that part of them. You can hold space for it. But you cannot reach it unless they choose to descend. And most won't. because descending means dismantling the entire system they built to survive. And survival is a powerful drug, more powerful than truth, more seductive than freedom, especially when they've convinced everyone, including themselves, that they are already healed. So you walk away, not with resentment, but with reverence. Reverence for your intuition, which never stopped whispering. Reverence for your pain, which pointed toward truth. Reverence for your boundaries, which finally held. And most of all, reverence for your shadow, the parts of you were brave enough to meet, while they were busy performing their light. Jung once said wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration. The most dangerous person isn't loud because they've cut off so much of themselves that all that remains is performance. But you have chosen integration. And that choice makes you powerful, not loud, not perfect, but whole. And that is what remains when the noise fades, when the mask falls, when the silence is no longer threatening. You remain. With your grief, with your truth, with your humanity, fully awake, fully present, fully alive. And that not silence, not volume, not the mask of peace is what makes you truly safe. The power of a denied self. There is a part of you that you've buried so deeply that even your silence avoids it. It stirs in moments you don't talk about, the flicker of shame behind your smile, the sudden sadness that rises for no reason, the way your voice changes when you're trying too hard to sound okay. You've disowned pieces of yourself not because you're weak, but because it once felt necessary to survive, to belong, to be loved. And now, all these years later, those pieces are no longer gone, but exiled. Watching, waiting, growing stronger in the dark. Carl Jung warned that what we do not make conscious will return as fate. But what if the most powerful force shaping our lives isn't fate at all? What if it's the self we refuse to face? This is the quiet tragedy of the denied self. Not the self you show the world, but the one you turned away from in childhood, the one that felt too raw, too angry, too needy, too strange. So you buried it, not with intention, but with survival, and you told yourself stories to justify its absence. I'm just not an emotional person. I'm over it. That's not who I am anymore. But deep down, there's a tension, a feeling that something essential was lost in the process of becoming what others expected you to be. And it never quite leaves. You feel it when you're alone, when you're in a crowd and still feel like a stranger. When something good happens and you can't feel it. Not fully, not honestly. Like you're living your life through a layer of glass. Jung spoke of the shadow, the unconscious aspect of the personality that the ego does not recognize in itself. But this isn't just some dark, menacing part of you. It is your denied potential, your repressed vitality. It's the energy of the child who once screamed, cried, raged, and dreamed freely before being taught which parts of them were acceptable and which were shameful. And the more you suppress that energy, the more it turns against you. Not violently, but invisibly. It shows up as apathy, as numbness, as the quiet feeling that you're going through the motions of a life that isn't really yours. Schopenhauer believed that repression of the will, our true inner drive, is the root of suffering. And in many ways, our society rewards this repression. You're praised for being composed, for fitting in, for not making things difficult. But beneath that praise is a silent funeral, a burial of the authentic self, the one who wanted something different, the one who questioned, rebelled, felt too much, wanted too much. That self didn't disappear. It just stopped speaking. And now its silence shapes everything. Your choices, your relationships, your sense of meaning. There's a reason your relationships feel unfulfilling, even when they look perfect. There's a reason your ambitions don't satisfy you, even when you reach them. It's because you're chasing things that match the image you created, not the self you buried. And eventually, the denied self begins to fight back. Not with violence, but with symptoms. Anxiety, depression, exhaustion. These are not defects. They are messages. From the parts of you that you tried to silence, from the self that is tired of being ignored. The power of a denied self is that it never truly dies. It lives in the background of every decision you make. It whispers through your regrets. It haunts the spaces between who you are and who you might have been. And the longer it remains unconscious, the more control it gains. You think you are in charge. But something deeper is pulling the strings. A script written long ago in moments you've forgotten, but your body remembers. This is the paradox. The more you reject yourself, the more you are ruled by what you reject. It's not your success that defines you, not your performance, not even your growth. It's your relationship with what you deny, with the wounds you never healed, the desires you never admitted, the truths you never allowed yourself to speak. And the longer you pretend they aren't there, the louder they become in silence. They sabotage your intimacy. They distort your perception. They make you afraid of your own reflection. But here's what's even more dangerous than denial adaptation. You don't just deny yourself. You learn to function without yourself, to build a life around the absence. You learn how to smile without feeling, how to speak without revealing, how to succeed without fulfillment. And people admire you for it, because they don't see what you've lost. But you do. In the quiet, in the questions you can't answer, in the way you sometimes look in the mirror and feel like a stranger to your own eyes. This is not a life. It's a performance. And the denied self is backstage holding all the power. Not as a villain, but as the forgotten author of your story. The one who once held your deepest truth and is now watching you live without it. Jung knew this pain well. He wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain," because waking up means remembering everything you had to forget in order to survive. And remembering means feeling again. Reconnecting with the parts you buried not because they were wrong, but because they were real. And now they're calling you back. There is a moment in every inner life where silence becomes unbearable. Not the silence around you, but the silence within you. The silence of the denied self that no longer agrees to stay hidden. It returns in strange ways. In the middle of the night, in the middle of success, in the middle of a conversation you can no longer fake. You feel it like a presence, something watching your life from the inside out, waiting to be remembered. At first, it unsettles you. You call it anxiety, restlessness, even sabotage. But it is none of those things. It is the ghost of your own aliveness, and it wants to come home. When Carl Jung wrote about the process of individuation, he was not speaking about becoming special. He was speaking about becoming whole, about the painful return to the parts of the self we exiled in order to be loved, to be accepted, to feel safe. But the price of safety was fragmentation. The person you had to become left behind, the person you really were. And for a time, this adaptation worked. It helped you function, perform, succeed. But now you're starting to feel the cost. the emotional flatness, the spiritual disconnection, the sense that something important is missing and always has been. You were told to let go of the past, but the truth is, the past never let go of you. It lives in the denied self, in the child who wasn't protected, the teenager who wasn't understood, the adult who still wonders why everything feels like a mask. These parts of you carry stories, not just memories, but meaning. And when you deny them, you deny your own depth. You flatten yourself into roles worker, partner, achiever, while the core of your being drifts further out of reach. Nietzsche warned, "He who despises himself still respects himself as one who despises." In other words, even in self-rejection, the self remains present. It doesn't disappear. It just twists itself into shadows and symptoms. This is why healing is so difficult. Because the denied self doesn't return with a smile. It returns with anger, with grief, with the rawness of unmet needs and unspoken pain. It forces you to feel what you were taught to numb. It confronts every mask you've worn, every lie you believed about who you had to be. And it asks a question you're terrified to answer. What would remain of your life if everything that was built on self-denial were to collapse? The answer is frightening. Because much of what we call identity is actually armor. Personality traits that once were survival strategies. Preferences that were shaped by fear. Values that were inherited, not chosen. And somewhere underneath it all, a soul that is tired of performing. A voice that has been waiting patiently, painfully for you to hear it again. But the longer you delay that encounter, the more distorted your outer world becomes. Relationships feel misaligned. Achievements feel hollow. Joy feels unreachable. Because none of it is reaching the self it was meant for. The denied self cannot receive what the false self collects. Jung believed that integration of the shadow is not just about facing your darkness, it is about reclaiming your fullness, your fire, your freedom. But integration is not aesthetic. It's not graceful. It's messy, emotional, humbling. It requires you to sit in the discomfort of your contradictions, to admit that the image you've crafted isn't the whole story, that there is more to you than what is visible. More depth, more madness, more truth. And yet most people never do this. They stay in performance, in control, in egoic illusions that keep them safe and disconnected. Alfred Adler once suggested that the fundamental drive in human beings is not pleasure or power, but significance. And if your denied self doesn't feel significant, it will sabotage everything that doesn't honor its existence. You'll leave relationships that feel fine on paper. You'll destroy careers that look successful from the outside. You'll walk away from comfort, not because you're broken, but because something inside you knows it was never real. There is power in the denied self, because it holds the essence of your original wholeness. The child who felt things deeply. The teenager who wanted to scream. The adult who still dreams of something more but doesn't know why it all feels so far away. That essence never left you. It simply waited. Beneath the layers of conditioning, beneath the years of pretending, it waited. And now, it is rising not to ruin your life, but to reclaim it. You begin to notice the shift when you stop apologizing for your truth, when you stop labeling your pain as weakness, when you sit with your anger and realize it's not dangerous, it's sacred. It's a signal that something vital has been ignored for too long. The denied self doesn't ask for attention to cause drama. It asks because it is dying, and only your willingness to listen can bring it back to life. The moment you turn toward it, the trembling, wounded, brilliant part of you that was never allowed to exist fully, you begin the journey home. Not to some higher version of yourself, but to the whole version, the human version, the honest version, the one who no longer needs to perform for approval or shrink to survive or silence the voice that never stopped speaking. And that is the moment everything begins to change. There is a threshold we all fear to cross. It's not the edge of failure or heartbreak or even death. It's the doorway to ourselves. The moment we stop running from what we feel, from what we've hidden, from who we were before the world taught us to be someone else. That moment is quiet but total. A reckoning that doesn't come with answers, only mirrors. Because when you finally stop, when you finally turn inward, you don't meet peace. You meet what you've denied. The denied self doesn't greet you with comfort. It greets you with everything you tried not to feel. You might cry without knowing why. You might shake with old rage that never had permission to surface. You might grieve for a version of yourself you abandoned before you ever really knew her. And the grief is real. Because denial is a form of psychological death. Every time you told yourself, "I'm fine," when you weren't. Every time you laughed to avoid the pain. Every time you swallowed the truth just to be accepted. It all left scars. And now the self beneath those scars is resurfacing not to punish you, but to be claimed. Carl Jung wrote that the path to wholeness demands a descent into the unconscious. But what he didn't mean was to lose yourself in darkness. He meant that to become whole, you must welcome what you've split off, what you've exiled, the parts of you that carry shame, fear, longing, and unmet need. The denied self is not evil, it is unloved. And like anything unloved, it grows twisted in isolation. It acts out, it distorts, it demands to be seen, not because it wants power, but because it wants presence. This is why people self-sabotage, not because they want to fail, but because a part of them, the denied self, wants to rupture the illusion, to expose the mask, to burn down the false identity that's been starving their truth. Schopenhauer called suffering the consequence of resisting the inner will, and the denied self is the inner will, pushed underground, forced into silence, but the will is not obedient. It returns, in neurosis, in compulsion, in depression, not as punishment, but as protest. Your pain is not the enemy. It is the rebellion of a self that refuses to stay buried. And when it surfaces, it won't be pretty. The process of integration is violent not outwardly, but inwardly. It shakes the structures you built to protect the lie, the relationships that depended on your silence, the roles that required your absence, the choices that made sense only because they served your performance, not your truth. And you will feel lost, as if the ground is crumbling, as if nothing is certain anymore. That's how you know you're close. Because truth doesn't arrive in clarity. It arrives in collapse. When the false self loses its grip. When the carefully curated identity begins to fracture. When you stop knowing who you're supposed to be and start remembering who you actually are. And this remembering is not a mental exercise. It's embodied. You feel it in your chest, in your gut, in the tremble of your voice when you speak what was once unspeakable. And slowly, you begin to shift. You stop seeking validation from people who only know your mask. You stop compromising for comfort. You stop abandoning yourself to belong. Because you've seen what that costs. And you've decided it's too expensive. You'd rather be alone than perform. You'd rather be messy than fake. you'd rather be whole than admired. This is what Jung meant when he said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Not a better version, not a more likable version, a true version, integrated, raw, awake. A self that includes all the denied parts, the jealousy, the rage, the grief, the desire, the contradictions, the need. All of it no longer hidden, but honored. And in this honoring, you begin to reclaim your power. Because power doesn't come from pretending. It comes from presence, from the courage to be seen as you are, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's terrifying, even when it costs you everything you built while running from yourself. You will lose things, people, illusions, opportunities that required your denial to succeed. But you will gain something else, something unshakable, a sense of self that cannot be taken, manipulated, or forgotten. Because it is no longer a performance. It is a return, a homecoming, to the one place you've never truly left but forgot how to inhabit. And from that place, something radical becomes possible. You no longer fear your own depth. You no longer fear your own voice. You no longer fear your own reflection. You begin for the first time to trust yourself. Trusting yourself isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself with fanfare or certainty. It whispers. It lives in the quiet refusal to betray your truth one more time, in the sacred pause before you say yes out of fear, in the moment you tell someone no and mean it, in the way you finally stop explaining yourself to those committed to misunderstanding you. That is the voice of the self you denied. Not broken, not weak, not shameful, but holy and home. Carl Jung knew that most people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid confronting their own soul. Because to face the soul is to face everything you've buried. The stories you were told, the shame you inherited, the masks you wore to survive in a world that asked for performance instead of presence. But if you've made it this far, if you've followed the thread of this reckoning into your own silence, then you already know the cost of not facing yourself is far greater than the pain of finally doing so. You've lived long enough with the consequences of absence. The empty relationships where you were never fully seen, the choices that made sense on paper but left your spirit aching. The chronic sense that something was missing even when everything looked right. That something was not an opportunity, not a partner, not a breakthrough. It was you, the denied self, waiting in the periphery, growing more powerful with every compromise, every apology you made for simply existing. And now you see what that power is capable of. Because here's the truth, the denied self does not die. It evolves. It matures in the dark. And when it returns, it is not here to ruin your life. It's here to reclaim it, to remind you that the parts of yourself you were taught to fear were not dangerous. They were just unvalidated, misunderstood, contained in a system too small to hold your complexity. But now you no longer belong to that system. You no longer exist to be digestible. You exist to be whole. This is the power of a denied self. Once integrated, it becomes your deepest wisdom. The rage that once scorched your throat becomes clarity. The grief that paralyzed you becomes compassion. The fear you buried becomes courage. Not the absence of fear, but the intimacy with it. You no longer need to conquer your darkness. You just need to sit with it long enough to learn its name. And when you do, a strange thing happens. You begin to feel real, not perfect, not fixed, just real. And realness is a force. It changes everything. You start attracting people who feel familiar at the level of the soul. You stop needing to be liked in rooms where your truth is unwelcome. You stop negotiating your worth with those who are committed to versions of you that never existed. And most importantly, you stop trying to escape your own depth. You return to the dream you once had before the world made you small. The dream of being free, not in the superficial sense of doing whatever you want, but in the sacred sense of being who you are. Without editing, without disguise, without denial. And in that freedom, the denied self finally exhales. Not as a ghost, not as a wound, but as a guide. You become someone who cannot be manipulated by shame, who does not flinch in the face of complexity, who knows that healing doesn't always look graceful, who knows that truth is sometimes ugly, but always worth it. You become the person you needed when you first began to disappear. And that changes everything. Because in a world built on denial, wholeness is rebellion. Presence is power. And authenticity, the kind that comes from integrating every broken piece, is the most dangerous form of truth. The power of a denied self is not in how loud it screams. It's in how quietly it reclaims you. It returns not to destroy, but to make you real. And if you let it in, if you let it speak, if you let it feel, there is something waiting on the other side that no performance can ever give you. Peace. Not the peace of avoidance, the peace of return, the peace of finally being who you were before the world taught you to leave yourself behind. Why we fear the good ones. There is a kind of person who never raises their voice, never forgets to say thank you, never takes more than they're given. They are soft-spoken, dependable, gentle with their words, and careful not to inconvenience others. You've met them. You may even have been raised by one. And yet, something inside you flinches around them. Something invisible pulls back, tightens, recoils, not from hatred, but from the unbearable weight of their goodness. You don't want to hurt them, but you also don't want to be seen by them. Their goodness does not feel safe. It feels dangerous, not because it harms, but because it disarms. We say we want kindness, yet when confronted with those who seem entirely selfless, endlessly patient, perpetually agreeable, we feel uneasy. Why? Why does our gut mistrust? What the mind calls good. Jung once said, every form of addiction is bad, no matter whether the narcotic be alcohol or morphine or idealism. Idealism, the relentless pursuit of moral perfection, can itself become pathological. And those we call the good ones are often addicts of this invisible drug. They don't rage. They don't retaliate. They swallow. They submit. They turn the other cheek so consistently that you begin to wonder if they ever had a face of their own. Beneath their kindness lies something that cannot speak, not because it doesn't want to, but because it was never allowed to. The good one is not born, they are built. Sculpted by years of conditional love, of being praised for silence, rewarded for pleasing, punished for need. They learned early that goodness buys safety, that anger is abandonment, that truth is too dangerous to tell unless it's dipped in honey. And so they became good, not in the moral sense, but in the performative one. Goodness became a survival strategy, not a virtue. The problem is, no mask stays light forever. Over time, the performance begins to rot. They keep saying yes when they mean no. They keep smiling when they are collapsing. They keep giving from a cup that's long been empty. And we unconsciously feel it. That's why their goodness unsettles us, because it's not entirely real. It's a silence that was forced, not chosen. A peace that cost them their wholeness. And somewhere deep in the animal body, we sense the tension beneath the surface. We fear the storm they refuse to name. This is not to demonize kindness. True kindness is powerful, sacred, and rare. But the compulsive need to be good is not the same as being whole. Wholeness includes darkness. It includes no. It includes the willingness to disappoint. The good ones were often never given that permission. So they became temples of restraint, shrines of compliance. They carry the burden of making everyone else comfortable, while silently suffocating under the pressure of their own repression. We fear them because they remind us of a truth we don't want to face, that goodness can be a form of hiding, that love can be manipulated through guilt, that kindness, when not rooted in authenticity, becomes its own form of violence, the violence of denial, of omission, of self-erasure. And maybe, just maybe, we sense that the cost of their goodness is a cost we've also paid, that we too have played the role of the peacekeeper while our soul quietly bled beneath the floorboards. In the eyes of the good one, we see a mirror, and not the flattering kind. It's a mirror that reflects every time we said, "It's okay," when it wasn't. Every time we forgave what we should have grieved. Every time we tried to be what they needed instead of who we were. That's why we fear them. Because their goodness is a ghost of who we once became to survive. And if you've ever loved a good one, you'll know this truth. It's not easy to reach them. They nod. They agree. They care. But something is missing, some edge of rawness, some crack of truth that lets the light in. They've buried it so deep they can no longer find it. And part of you mourns that. Because you don't just want their kindness. You want their fire. You want their truth. You want the parts they locked away when they were taught that love must always be soft. This is the wound that lives behind the smile, the rage behind the sweetness, the longing behind the silence. And it's why, when we stand in front of the good, one part of us instinctively steps back, not because they are unsafe, but because we know they are not fully here. And neither perhaps are we. There is a violence that never raises its hand, a violence that dresses itself in courtesy and obliges everyone in the room. It is the violence of never saying no, of never being angry, of never taking up space. And for the good ones, this violence is self-inflicted. But it is not benign. It is corrosive. Their goodness may look like light from the outside, but inside it burns like acid. The most dangerous part, no one sees it. Not even them. Especially not them. They've convinced themselves that their pain is the price of love, that to be lovable means to be agreeable, safe, easy to manage. They believe that as long as they are useful, they will be wanted. As long as they don't disturb the peace, they will belong. But belonging at the cost of your truth is not belonging. It's bondage. The smile they wear is not warmth, it is armor. Their calm is not peace, it is suppression perfected. Adler spoke of the human hunger for significance, and how it often twists itself into the need to be needed. The good ones rarely ask themselves what they want. Instead, they become who others need them to be. Not because they are weak, but because at some point in their life, their strength was punished. Their truth was too much. Their defiance was unsafe. So they rewired themselves to survive. And that rewiring became the character they now call me. They are not pretending. They've simply forgotten that the performance ever started. But here's the truth no one dares to say aloud. We don't truly trust people who never express need. We don't feel close to those who never show cracks. Intimacy requires risk. Connection requires contrast. Without it, something inside us stays guarded. The more perfect someone appears, the more inauthentic they feel. And while we may admire their kindness from a distance, we struggle to feel truly seen by them. Because in their self-erasure, there is no invitation to be real. Their goodness becomes a wall, not a bridge. Nietzsche warned us, whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster. But what happens when the monster is not rage or cruelty, but silence? What happens when the person loses themselves? In the endless performance of being good, they become unknowable. Not because they are hiding something malicious, but because they are hiding everything. Every unspoken resentment, every repressed desire, every buried scream lives like ghosts in their nervous system. And ghosts, no matter how quiet, haunt. You may have tried to love someone like this, to break through their calm, to tell them you don't have to always be okay. And maybe they nodded, maybe they even cried. But the next morning, they were back in costume, back in character. Not because they were lying, but because they didn't know how to stay uncovered. Vulnerability felt like exposure, and exposure felt like danger. Their survival system doesn't trust softness unless it's rehearsed. So even when they try to be real, they quickly retreat into what feels safe, perfection. This is why we fear the good ones. Because loving them is like loving a room with locked doors. You keep circling, but you never find the center. You feel the presence of something sacred, something vast, something buried, but it never quite emerges. And so you grieve. You grieve what you never got to touch. You grieve the intimacy that was always just out of reach. You grieve for them and for yourself. But perhaps the deeper fear, the one we don't name, is this: what if we are one of them? What if the reason their smile unsettles us is because it looks like ours? What if their compulsive need to please mirrors the mask we wear in our own life? What if their emotional absence is the same absence we carry inside, that we hide behind achievements, politeness, selflessness? What if we are not afraid of their goodness, but of the parts of ourselves we've sacrificed to be good? This is the shadow Jung spoke of. Not the darkness of evil, but the parts of the self that had to be hidden to survive. For some, the shadow is aggression, desire, dominance. For others, it is simply the right to say no, the right to be disliked, the right to take up space without apology. The good ones often buried these rights so deeply they forgot they ever had them. But the psyche never forgets, and what is repressed returns sometimes as illness, sometimes as fatigue, sometimes as the quiet ache that says, there must be more than this. The fear we feel is not of them, but of the illusion they maintain, an illusion we have also helped to maintain. That being lovable means being soft. That being accepted means being agreeable. That being moral means being small. And deep down, we know the price of that illusion. It's why the good ones break in silence, why they burn out quietly, why they disappear while still sitting in the room. Because goodness without truth is exile, and no amount of praise can substitute for the soul's need to be whole. There is a point at which goodness no longer serves connection, it begins to sabotage it. Not deliberately, not maliciously, but inevitably. Because when goodness becomes a condition for love, it stops being a gift and becomes a requirement. And once it becomes a requirement, authenticity dies. The good ones, those who cannot say no, who are always thoughtful, generous, forgiving, understanding, they eventually lose the ability to feel known. People thank them. People admire them. But few ever truly meet them. And this is where the wound deepens. Because underneath all their goodness, many of these people are starving for intimacy. Not the kind that comes from being liked, but the kind that comes from being witnessed. Fully, raw, undone. The kind that doesn't flinch when the truth is ugly. The kind that survives disappointment. But when you've been conditioned to equate love with being good, you begin to fear that the truth of who you are, your resentment, your desire, your complexity, will make you unlovable. So you keep offering what is acceptable and hiding what is real. Eventually, you begin to disappear from your own life. This disappearance is subtle. It looks like being easygoing, like being supportive, like being the one everyone can rely on. But it is not wholeness, it is disappearance, dressed as virtue. And people pick up on it. Even if they don't understand it consciously, they feel the absence. They feel the hollowness behind the kindness. They feel the exhaustion hidden beneath the helpfulness. And at some level, they begin to mistrust it. Because goodness, when not grounded in truth, becomes manipulative, not because it intends to control, but because it unconsciously demands reciprocity. I never ask for anything, says the good one. But they are asking, every day, silently, for love, for permission, for someone to finally tell them you are allowed to be messy too. This is what Nietzsche meant when he wrote, "He who despises himself still respects himself as one who despises." But when self-contempt becomes disguised as virtue, it hardens into identity. Many good ones were taught to despise their complexity, their emotions, their rage, their lust, their will to power. So they renounced them. Not out of enlightenment, but out of fear. They mistook denial for discipline, suppression for strength. But there is nothing strong about disappearing to be loved. There is only grief, grief that accumulates in the body, that floods the nervous system in quiet hours, that wakes them at night with the aching question, if I stopped being good, would anyone stay? That's the hidden terror. Not that they'll be rejected, but that they will be forgotten once they stop performing. That their value exists only in how useful, pleasing, or emotionally convenient they are to others. So they keep smiling, keep offering, keep shrinking, and in doing so they lose not just their truth, but their boundaries. And when a person has no boundaries, they can no longer trust their relationships. Because how can you know someone loves you if you never give them the chance to love the parts you've hidden? So they remain alone, surrounded by people but emotionally exiled. They are not abandoned, they are unseen. Not because others are cruel, but because they have hidden the very parts of themselves that long to be held. And here lies the most tragic irony: the good ones often feel the loneliest. Because no one ever meets their real self, only the persona, the caretaker, the giver, the gentle presence who never makes demands. And the longer they maintain this role, the harder it becomes to remember who they were before it. Even Carl Jung warned that the persona, the social mask we wear to fit into the world, must never be mistaken for the self. He wrote, "The persona is a mask for the collective psyche, a mask that pretends individuality while repressing it. For the good ones, the mask becomes so seamless, so convincing, that even they believe it. But the psyche knows better. It knows what has been exiled. It knows what it costs to be loved. And the cost is not just personal. It ripples outward. Because when goodness becomes a cage, it creates distortion in every relationship it touches. People walk on eggshells, unsure how to relate to someone who never expresses hurt. Friends feel guilty, sensing the imbalance, but unable to name it. Partners become frustrated, yearning for more passion, more truth, more depth, but feeling punished when they ask for it. And the good one, confused and hurt, thinks, but I gave everything. Why isn't it enough? It isn't enough because it isn't whole. Because people don't want perfection. They want presence. They want the full spectrum of another human being. The laughter and the sorrow. The patience and the anger. The forgiveness and the boundaries. The truth even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts. Because that's where trust is built, not in being flawless, but in being real. We fear the good ones because they remind us of the danger of hiding, of what it looks like to live an entire life inoffensive, agreeable, and invisible. They force us to confront our own patterns, our own need to please, to be seen as good, to avoid conflict at the cost of ourselves. And deep down, we know this, a goodness that denies the self is not love. It is exile. And if we do not reckon with that, we will inherit their loneliness. It always begins quietly, the unraveling. Not with screams, but with silence that tightens. Not with betrayal, but with a slow recognition I have been disappearing for years. The good one starts to feel it in the way people forget to ask how they're doing. In the way no one notices their exhaustion. In the way love feels more like a task to maintain than a presence to receive. They have been everything for everyone, and now they can barely feel themselves. The soul is not designed for erasure. You can numb it, delay it, bury it under duties and smiles and thank yous, but eventually it will speak. And when it does not use words. It uses illness, depression, chronic fatigue, emotional flatness. A subtle rage that simmers under the surface like a fault line. The good ones begin to snap in small ways, not in violence, but in withdrawal. They stop responding to messages. They cancel plans. They fantasize about disappearing, not to be found, not to be needed. Not because they hate the world, but because they have no idea who they are without the role. And this is the reckoning. This is the moment when the mask becomes too heavy, and the self begins to ask, who would I be if I stopped performing? Who am I beneath all this goodness? That question is terrifying and holy. It is the doorway out of exile. But to walk through it, they must face everything they were taught to deny. They must reclaim their right to be inconvenient, to be angry, to be selfish sometimes, to say no without guilt, to say yes for no one's benefit but their own. They must remember their fire, the one they extinguished to keep everyone else warm. Schopenhauer believed that suffering was not only inevitable, but instructive. That through pain, we are stripped of illusion. And here too, pain is the catalyst. The good ones do not change because someone tells them to. They change because the cost of being good finally becomes greater than the fear of being real. But this transformation is not loud. It doesn't come with declarations or dramatic exits. It begins in small, defiant choices. Saying, I don't agree without softening it. Asking for help and not apologizing for it. Letting someone down and surviving the discomfort. Feeling rage and not translating it into shame. These are not acts of rebellion. They are acts of return. The return to a self that was never bad, only buried. And for those around them, this change is disorienting. The ones who loved their compliance will call it selfishness. The ones who benefited from their silence will call it coldness. The ones who romanticized their sacrifice will feel betrayed. Because when a good one awakens, the entire system around them is forced to adjust. And not everyone wants that. Not everyone wants the truth. Some only want the role to continue. But truth has its own gravity. Once it begins to emerge, it refuses to go back underground. And if the good one stays the course, if they keep choosing reality over performance, something miraculous happens. people begin to meet them. Not the persona, not the perfect presence, but the person whole, flawed, radiant with contradiction. And in that meeting, intimacy is finally possible. This is the paradox. When we stop trying to be good, we become real. And realness, not performance, is what the soul longs for. Goodness can be manufactured, but presence cannot. Presence is costly. It requires saying no when it's easier to say yes. It requires being disliked. It requires losing the approval of those who only love the mask. But what it gives in return is life, not survival life. Jung reminded us that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, not who others find comfortable, not who your parents praised, not who your culture rewarded, but who you are when no one is watching, when there is no applause, when there is only silence, and in that silence, your truth rising like a tide that can no longer be held back. We fear the good ones because we know how much they've suffered to be seen that way. We fear them because they reflect our own buried selves. But more than that, we fear their awakening, because it threatens our illusions. It confronts us with a new reality that goodness without wholeness is not virtue. It is a slow disappearance, and if we are not careful, we will disappear too. So let us end not with comfort, but with invitation. If you are one of the good ones, ask yourself this: what would it cost you to be whole? Not loved, not praised, not admired, but whole. And are you willing finally to pay the price? Because if you are, then you are not just good, you are brave, and that changes everything.